all with us today on this call, representing tech practitioners, civil society advocates, governmental regulators, and funders interested in all sorts of different issue areas. To get us started, first I'd like to pass the mic along to Michelle Shevin from the Ford Foundation and Eli Sugarman from the Hewlett Foundation as our co-sponsors today to officially welcome you all. Michelle, Eli, Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces and new faces today. And thank you so much for joining to learn more about the Integrity Institute. My name is Michelle Shevin. I work at the Ford Foundation on the Technology and Society team. We're actually supporters of the Integrity Institute through a pooled fund, the Public Interest Technology Infrastructure Table, which I'm happy to talk more about in the chat if anyone has questions. And that table supports public interest technology career pathways and pipelines, mechanisms to prioritize public interest values like transparency, representation, accountability, and others, and really also tries to build effective cross-sector collaboration capacity. So it should come as no surprise that we're excited about Integrity Institute's mission to really connect the people who have experience working on tech platforms to the sort of cross-sector emerging ecosystem of efforts around research, advocacy, and policy. We think this is a really important vehicle for bringing those voices into conversations about what effective future directions for technology look like. Really happy to pass the mic to Eli. Fun to be with Eli in this space, and really looking forward to the conversation today. So thanks again to everyone.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, everybody. I'm Eli Sugarman. I wear two philanthropic hats for the purposes of this event. I am the director of the Cyber Initiative at the Hewlett Foundation. That is sort of my moonlighting side hustle. I spend the bulk of my time at Schmidt Futures in the family office of Eric and Wendy Schmidt. And we are pleased to very soon be a funder of the Integrity Institute. So I think you'll see news about that in the coming weeks. And really excited about the organization's approach to really bringing, like Michelle said, that practitioner viewpoint from trust and safety, from integrity teams who we view as sort of the guardians of the internet, if you will, those who want to protect users. And really excited to see that field mature and grow, hopefully learn from where the cyber field excelled and fell short. And really, as we see sort of, different kinds of platforms, different companies coming online with the move to immersive, distributed, and decentralized systems, I think the risk to users and the potential for harm is greater. And so we really need a stronger grounding, really more robust methodologies, and to honor and respect the diversity of those experts who've been working on this for a long time, and really adequately resource them to bring that voice to the policy conversation, to educate the public, and to really think about how do we talk about the system as opposed to just sort of discrete issue verticals. And so just really excited to join you. I'm very excited to see so many friends and colleagues on, and I will stop rambling and hand it back to the Integrity Institute team.
Thank you so much, Michelle and Eli, for saying such nice words about us. So for now, let me go through today's agenda. First, we'll start off with an introduction to the Integrity Institute and what we like to see from social media companies by our co-founders, Sahar Masachi and Jeff Allen. Following that, in keeping with the briefing's theme on building bridges across different roles in this ecosystem for a healthy social internet, we've brought together 3 thematic panels. Within each panel, you'll hear from tech practitioners and partners across the ecosystems on examples of and important lessons learned from these bridge building endeavors. We'll also have select funders offer their reflection at the end of each of these panels. Finally, we've reserved quite a bit of time for open discussions and Q&A. And a note about this format. Throughout this briefing, please continuously pop in any questions, comments into the chat. My colleague, Rachel Fagan, will be monitoring the chat regularly, and we'll do our best to make sure to address at least one question at the end of each of these panels, while reserving the majority of your questions and comments towards the end, that block of open discussion and Q&A. If we cannot get to all of your questions and comments, we'll make sure to follow up individually after today's briefing. Now, you've graciously decided to spend 90 minutes today with us. So here are a few things that we hope you will take away after today's briefing. First, especially for new friends, an idea about who we are at the Integrity Institute and how we work with others in this ecosystem. From the three panels, we hope you'll get a sense of where there might be readily available solutions already, policy or otherwise, to some of the problems that we see on the social internet today, and where you could strategically intervene to achieve impact. Finally, look around this room. At the Integrity Institute, we aspire to be the glue to bring tech practitioners together with others in the space. And we hope you'll also find connections for your own work among all the awesome people and partners and friends present in this room today, especially connections that you might not have foreseen before joining our briefing. So without further delay, let me pass first to Sahar Masachi, Executive Director and co-founder of the Integrity Institute, for the first portion of the introduction.
Thanks, Sean. Hi, everyone. This is the part where I talk for about 13, 14, 15 minutes to just lay out some thoughts and facts. Normally, I'd say interaction is great. Please interrupt. There are enough people here that I think that might not be a good idea, but please spam the chat. And I hope you like it. Here we go. So, proposition to you. The social internet should help individuals, society, and democracy thrive. Sounds good, doesn't it? We're not seeing that. And I think that if you're on this call, you're probably agree with that, and we don't have to dive into it. There are a lot of problems. So next slide. A lot of groups are trying to address this problem, but they're missing something. They all lack experience actually working on platforms. And we think this is really important. Next. So people who have experience working on platforms, especially the kind of people we're talking about, which is integrity workers, we'll explain that in a minute, have seen what works and what doesn't, understand the problems from their root causes all the way to the impact on users, and have seen how platforms make decisions and sort of the ecosystem of how decisions can both be decentralized and centralized, and how those decisions can be changed. Integrity professionals are those people. We are people who are tech workers who have worked on problems like this, which you'll see include what people call trust and safety, but also involve data transparency and reporting, thinking about information operations, thinking about quality. If you are thinking about how to fix the problems of a social platform, not in terms of short-term growth, short-term engagement, or short-term profit, you might be an integrity worker, and that gives you a sort of bird's eye view of the entire system. Next. So until recently, if you wanted this information, if you wanted to talk to these workers, you'd have to make a devil's bargain. You'd have to go through the PR team of the company they worked for, which wasn't great until we came along. So we have, I think, over 190 members by now, who are specific people joining as people, joining weekly, who have worked on and have experience on more than 50 platforms. This is huge. Next. So a way to think about what we are is we are a think tank, but we are also a community organization. Everything okay there? Great. So our mission is we advance the theory and practice of protecting the social internet powered by our community of integrity professionals. So when we say protecting the social internet, we mean two-sided marketplaces, social apps, social media, social networks, the whole shebang. And the way we do it is, first, we build this community of people, and we put a lot of energy into making it a real thriving community of people who actually like each other and feel bonded together. Next, we develop the theory and practice of what this new kind of work is. And, theory and practice and everything in between. And lastly, we share this expertise of our community that we've both gathered and developed with the rest of the world. And there's another way of thinking about it, which is our vision. The social internet should help individuals, societies, and democracies thrive. And it's important to us that one of the things that we've seen from our work is that if you took the individual summation of harms to individuals you don't get harms to societies. Societies are, a different sort of unit, and looking at lots of individuals thriving won't get you to society thriving necessarily. And the last thing I want to point out here is that we're explicitly pro-democracy, which, I think we all feel is really important and drives us. So how do we do impact? Next, we do a bunch of things. The first thing is we think companies and platforms need to do integrity better. We shine a light on what that looks like. We give guidance on the how, but we're sort of, there's many different ways to get there. The next thing we do is the world, including us, understands integrity theory and practice better. So we are educating ourselves as members, and also we're educating the world on what is this job, what is this theory, what are the physics behind what we're doing. Also, really importantly, we make being an integrity professional a salient identity, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. So the last thing is integrity professionals have more power and influence to do the right thing, both at the job and outside the job. Next, so we talk a lot about being a bridge between integrity professionals and the rest of the world, but there are 3 different ways to think about it. One way we talk about it is that we're a couple of two-sided marketplaces. So we have the marketplace of, we have our members at the core, and civil society wants to talk to them. That's a two-sided marketplace. And also platform workers and people who are building new social media or changing existing platforms want to hear from them. And we're brokering that as well. Another way of thinking about us is that we're a think tank, but an unconventional one. So a normal think tank is pointed at civil society, journalists, academics, policymakers, people in power. And we do that, and we do that really well, actually. But we're also pointing at platform companies and people who have the sort of power to change or build or edit code and products. And unlike most think tanks, we're powered by members. The third way to think about us is we're more than trust and safety. Our expertise comes from our work, but our territory covers a lot more. Next. So let's just go over some examples of what this looks like. So we advise policymakers and NGOs on things like, how do platforms actually work? Or how are they even thinking about things correctly? Like, how will they achieve their goals? We also advise tech companies, both on if they wanted to do the right thing, how to do it, or if they do the right thing, can they get credit for it? And we're validators to help set up a permission structure for them to do the right thing. And we bring up thoughts about like how to build for quality over right time. Next, we advise researchers in academia and journalists on how to think about things. Are we studying the right issues? I have this idea. Is it even useful? And also, lastly, we advise workers in their jobs. So how do I convince my company to allow me to do my job and prioritize my team? But also, how do I do my job? Help me level up in the work that I do. Next. So I think that we're positioned really interestingly, and I want to go over it quickly. So first off, we're honest brokers. We are not advocates. We talk about ourselves as wearing white lab coats and going through the scientist door, not through the activist or advocate door. And that's been really powerful for us. Next, we're independent. So we're a 501c3. We don't take money from platforms. Almost all our money comes from foundations. We could talk about why, but part of this is, as honest brokers, we don't pick fights, and that means that campaigning style funding is out of the question and would undermine our independence. And that, again, is very powerful. Next, we represent a constituency, which are integrity workers. And there are 2 different ways to do this. So next, one way to think about it is we build the field. Many of our members are in this room right now. What we are trying to do is not just lift up the profession, but lift up individual people in the profession and help them succeed both at their jobs and as public thinkers and intellectuals. The other way to think about it is we're defining a shared identity. So we are taking this concept, integrity worker, and we're saying that it covers many different kinds of seniority, many different kinds of company, and many different kinds of role. from threat intel to ranking to operations to policy to working on product, and making that a defined identity, making it higher in the stack of salient identities to our members. And we think this is sort of very important. Can talk about it more later. Next, and we're building capacity, so we can draw on our members to do things that allow us to punch up far above our weight. Two more. We're infrastructure. This goes with onerous brokers. We will share expertise to anyone who asks, and then make it public. And we're a C3. We're here to help the public. And lastly, we're unique. We're the only independent think tank representing integrity workers and their expertise in the world. And we are one of very few organizations that even attempt to represent integrity workers at all. So the theme of this whole day in part is how we all work well together. So I want to give you a sense of how we work well with others. So one thing that we do is just answer questions. And that's pretty easy. If you ask us a question we've heard a lot, we'll probably have a briefing on it and can just give it to you. If you have a question for our members, we can connect you to them. If you have, questions that are more tailored, we can make made-to-order briefings, and we'd be delighted to do so because you would help us understand where our advice would be most needed. One thing that we're really good at is being given documents, such as policy proposals or advocacy campaigns, and then commenting all over them and using that as a really clear, tangible anchor to talk about and give advice on. And lastly, for the harder stuff, we do partner. We partner with a lot of different organizations. We love partnering. And we can do big partnerships, small partnerships. And lastly, we can be contracted on a fee-for-service basis. We are creating a series of fellowships that are really exciting, and maybe we'll have time to talk about them. These are all just ideas. So in regards to our impact, we have a lot. So in the EU, we were heavily involved at a later stage of the Code of Practice of Information. We're helping with DSA style things. In the UK, we've been talking to Ofcom even before we were formally an organization. Hi, Colin, it's good to see you here. And, former PM Jacinda knows who we are, which is very cool. And this has come through our conversations with Christchurch Call, but also 2 other things in New Zealand. And you'll hear more about other countries soon. We're running out of time. You can read faster than I can speak. We also make impact on companies. So we're talking to companies directly. We're also doing original research and conversation that we think is changing company behavior directly from the outside, not through the medium of policymaking. And we have a best practices deck that has been adopted by startups, which is great. We have been partnering with a lot of different research organizations and just saying our truth in lots of different roundtables. And you can see everything from the Office of the President to Mozilla and everyone in between have been talking to us and citing us, and that's been really great. And we've even sent a amicus brief to the Supreme Court. Lastly, I want to talk about our community impact. On the left, you'll see a screenshot of one day of our weekly member email. This is about, I think, a third to a half of what that email is. And that can just give you a sense of what's going on behind the scenes and how members see us as giving value and bring value to the work we do. On the right, these are just things that members spontaneously told me one week, and I wrote them down, just a given week. These are the sort of things that members spontaneously tell us about what it's like here. I think to wrap up, this hopefully should give you a sense of who we are, what we're about, how we work, how we can work well with others. And I just really want to underscore we're dependent. Our values are centered around our own Hippocratic oath. And being a member-driven think tank has been maybe one of the more unique things that we are, and also has driven a lot of success. Thank you for your time. I'm going to hand it off to Jeff.
Hello, so I'm Jeff Allen, Chief Research Officer and co-founder of the Integrity Institute. And I'll be walking through some of our priority problem areas around social media. And when we say priority, it's both because these are problems that we care deeply about, but also they're problems that are tractable, and policy and external movements are, in play right now, right? And so there's a great opportunity to have real impact on them. So next slide, what are the priority problem areas as we see them? So there is exposure to harmful content, addiction and problematic overuse, bullying, harassment, unwanted contact, and privacy. And so to dig in a little bit deeper on these problem areas, right? So when we say exposure to harmful content, we mean, all types of harmful content. This includes hate speech, misinformation, self-harm content, and it's not just the exposure to it, right? It's not just people seeing the content, it's also why are they seeing it? What is the scale of the problem? Why are, how is it that people come to be exposed to harmful content on platforms? What's the design implications there? On addiction and problematic overuse, it's kind of just a truth that, information feeds can be habit forming and addicting. And, platform design plays a big role in this, right? Like problematic addiction can be amplified by bad design, bad algorithmic design, bad use of notifications and alerts. On the bullying, harassment, and unwanted contact, this can take a lot of different forms, but it's sort of platforms are a way for people to connect to each other. And so, of course, there's going to be people that wish other people harm, and platforms are going to be a part of how they inflict that harm. And again, platform design plays a big role in this, privacy settings, et cetera. And finally, there's privacy, right? Platforms necessarily collect a lot of private information from users. But the method and the extent to which the data is collected, right, like can end up causing harms, right, through the erosion of right to privacy, or just like doxing or problematic targeted ads. So I mentioned platform design a couple of times there, right? And so it's really important to dig on how the design of platforms plays a role in all of these harms. And it's really important to note, right, that every aspect of a platform's design is a choice that the company made, right? So whether or not you have engagement actions on content, like the like button or the retweet button, that is a choice that the company made, right? How algorithms are designed and used, again, are choices that the companies make, right? And so, if we actually want to make progress at the end of the day, right, like better platforms are going to come when teams ship more responsibly, right? When they build the platforms in a more responsible way. So we need the right teams inside the companies to have more influence and impact, and we need the companies overall to be making better decisions. And so this gets into the next sort of broad topic: how do you change company decisions? So if we go into the next slide, right, the goal of tech policy should really be to create an environment that incentivizes companies to do the right thing. And on top of that, right, mandate changes when that is truly necessary, right? So ultimately, the problems are going to be fixed when people at the companies fix them and ship better code and ship better products. And so really it's just like, how do we tilt the scale so that the right people internally are winning the fights, right? Or, actually step in and mandate changes. Right now it's important to point out, right, that we're sort of very, very early on in regulation of social media. If we go back 3 years ago, there's very, very little, right, that's creating incentives for companies to design responsibly. There's very little that is stopping companies from aggressively prioritizing, the platform growth or their own revenue, at the expense of their users, right, their users' health. And so, we're sort of entering this era now where, lots of countries are playing with regulation. And so what are the types of policy solutions, the broad buckets of solutions that we see having an impact on how companies make decisions? So solution number one, would be to create accountability via comprehensive and meaningful transparency, right? Right now, we're sort of in this state where, companies are only transparent a little bit out of the goodness of their heart, right? Like there's no reason why a platform has to today say, how many pieces of content, harmful content were on the platform? What is the prevalence of harmful content, right? And so we're sort of in the state right now where platforms are doing that in a way that sort of works for them, right? And doesn't quite reveal the true scale of harms happening on the platform, the true cause of the harms that are happening on the platform, right? And so absolutely, we could create more accountability from the companies if they were just required to be more transparent about the scale, the cause, and the nature of harms that occur on them, right? The role that platform design and algorithmic design plays in causing those harms, right? We have very little transparency in the public about that right now, and we think that with that transparency, we absolutely could be, incentivizing companies to design in more responsible ways. The next solution is mandating integrity best practices. So, in addition to be sort of early on in the policy, we're also a little bit early on in broadly accepted ways, broadly accepted best practices in building social media platforms. This is sort of one of the reasons that we developed the Integrity Institute, right? Is so that we could all share what works and what doesn't, right? So we can actually say like, yeah, as people who have worked on the inside, this is the right way to design a platform and this is the wrong way to design a platform. But there absolutely are some best practices that a lot of people agree on. If we can go to the next slide, and the counter to best practices, right, are limiting practices that are known to be bad and known to be risky. So again, it's like we're a little bit early on. We probably have not discovered yet all bad ways to design a platform. And I'm sure there's going to be a platform that comes out a few years from now that has developed a whole new way to be bad and be risky. But there absolutely are some practices that, practitioners in the field would broadly agree, right, are risky and should be limited. So we can have policy that limits those bad practices. When you combine all this, right, it's like the fact of how early we are in policy land, right? Like how little incentive companies have to design responsibly. I think there's a little bit of a pessimistic view there, but there's also the optimistic take, right? Which is we should have every expectation that the social internet can play a much more positive role in our lives as individuals and in our societies. We were just sort of opening up the toolbox, so to speak, right, in the policy framework. And so I think there's a lot of reason to be optimistic about the future. For some of the problems, and a lot of the problems that we'll talk about, there are like handy solutions that we can tap into, right? So, we mentioned transparency. If we want to go to the next slide, actually, we can just sort of list it out, right? So there's a lot of different ways that we've come up with at the Integrity Institute and that policymakers have played around with. That can have positive impact on a lot of the problems that we laid out. So, in this chart, this is sort of like how we keep track of all the different problems that we care about and what are the sort of solutions to them. So on the columns here, we have, exposure to harmful content for minors and adults, addiction for minors and adults, bullying, harassment, and privacy. And the rows here are sort of different policy solutions and ways to influence the companies from outside. So we have transparency, which kind of hits all the buckets, right? We think it could have broad impact on the companies. Same thing for external research, right? So if we empower external researchers, we think it could have broad impact across the problems. And then we can go through the list of parental controls, privacy settings, limiting the use of engagement-based ranking, limiting the use of recommendations, limiting notifications and ad targeting. So one of the reasons that we sort of titled this, could this be the biggest year for policy and social media, right, is because, the world has woken up, policymakers around the world have woken up, and there's been bills that have been passed. And we do think that there is a lot of opportunity to have positive change in the way that social media is built. And I will pass it back to Sean.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff and Sahar, especially for ending on a positive note there. I know we've just thrown a lot of information at you, so as a reminder, please continue to pop any questions, comments, issues into the chat, and my colleague Rachel is collecting them. So for the next portion, we're going to proceed through 3 different panels focusing on bridge building between tech professionals and various stakeholders working together to build a healthy social internet. For the first panel, bridge building for meaningful transparency from platforms, we're going to bring up Brendan Silverman, who is currently a fellow at both the George Washington University and the Integrity Institute and founder of CrowdTangle. We also have Sahar, who you've just heard about. Finally, we have two government regulators, Colin Curry from the United Kingdom's Ofcom and Lana Ford from the Australian government, to share some of their thoughts. At the end of this panel, Eli Sugarman from the Hewlett Foundation will offer some reflections, and we'll hopefully be able to answer one or a few questions there. So Brandon, I'm going to hand the mic over to you to get us started.
Great. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Is this coming through?
Yes.
Great. Well, yeah, it is a privilege to be here with everybody. Thank you, Sahar and Jeff and Sean and Rachel, everybody else for the invitation. I was taking a lot of notes as everyone was talking, entirely about off topic, all of the ways in which I think Integrity Institute is incredibly valuable to the world. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but I'm happy to. But I think for now, what I'm gonna do is talk a little bit about meaningful transparency and some of the work that I've seen the Integrity Institute do, but also just the broader topic at the moment. So, I think there are a lot of ideas out there in the world about how to build a better internet and how to build better social media. But one of the few things that regulators, academics, the public, and even the platforms themselves all seem to agree on is transparency. A few of my favorite examples are when literally Jack Dorsey's very final tweet when he resigned ended with a PS that said, "Dear Mom, I always wanted Twitter to be the most transparent company in the world." When the CEO of TikTok recently testified in the US Congress, the very first section of his written testimony was TikTok's commitment to transparency. Literally the very final word, his entire written testimony was the word transparency. You hear it over and over in this whole space. But the problem is there is very little actual work that's been done on what constitutes real meaningful transparency. And so at worst, what you get is companies who trot it out, not real genuine good faith aspirations for collaboration or co-governance or accountability, but because they know it plays well and they can get some points and it sounds good. And at worst, what they oftentimes are really doing is just pushing specific narratives they want to land in the public. And part of the reason that is possible is because there's not a lot of external infrastructure, expertise, work that's been done around what is really meaningful transparency on the internet and social media. And that is where the Integrity Institute has been able to play a huge role, even just in the last 18 months, as more and more regulators, public platforms have begun kind of leaning into this and being held to a higher bar on what it really looks like. So I could tell a bunch of stories on ways in which I've seen the Integrity Institute's work impact this space. It has also impacted how I think about it. Having a space where people who are in the weeds on platforms who have done this work can come together and share ideas and best practices has been incredibly valuable and doesn't exist anywhere else. Moreover, one of the most valuable things in this whole space is being able to have a community and a set of experts who can also respond in real time to an industry that is changing constantly. And so, when you talk about meaningful transparency, it is very different for a text-based, real-time news app like Twitter versus what it would look like in practice to do for short form video or ephemeral content, et cetera. So as this industry is changing, what you need is a set of experts in infrastructure that is able to move and change along with it. So I'm happy to go into all the specific moments where I've seen their work have a huge impact, but I think this is only going to continue to get more important over the next couple of years. There's the Digital Services Act in Europe, along with the Code of Practice on Disinformation, has a bunch of transparency requirements, a lot of which the work of the Integrity Institute impacted, but it's going to be coming into practice over the next several years and is going to be requiring a lot of very in the weeds technical knowledge and expertise that literally the Integrity Institute is one of the few entities on the planet that can provide. So I am incredibly bullish. I'm so thankful the Integrity Institute exists. I've been very honored to play a part in it. And I'm happy to kind of go through more details or talk in more specifics about what it's looked like. But they're playing an incredible role, and I it's only going to get more important over the next few years, especially with transparency. So I will pass it over to Sahar.
Thanks, Brandon. Part of why we exist is so that we could take people who are really good and should be honored in the field, like Brandon, and do our part to keep honoring them. Though, of course, Brandon, I think you didn't need that from us. I just wanted to quickly just add a few things. I think what you're saying is all right. One problem we have is that we have a new tech on the scene and no real way to see what the problems are with that tech. It's like trying to understand the impact of the institution of cars and highways in society only by looking at car crashes. You actually, things like air pollution, suburbanization, white flight, you don't get from looking at car crashes. In the same way, a lot of transparency suggestions or initiatives on the books are just transparency about the wrong thing and don't let you actually understand what's going on in society. That's all for me right now. We're behind. Handing it off to Colin, I think.
Hey, Colin.
Colin.
I think we're having trouble hearing you. No. Alana, if it's okay, maybe you can get started first and we'll have Colin join us after.
Very happy to. Thank you for inviting me to be here today. I was really thrilled when you asked me. I'm going to try and keep this super quick. But I have a couple things that I would really like to say. So I'm Alana Ford. I'm with the Australian government, as you mentioned. I'm actually with our Attorney General's department. I just don't tend to shop that around too much here when I'm engaging with tech because people just immediately think lawyer, and I'm definitely not that. I work in our cybercrime and cross-border data branch, and I'm based at the Australian Embassy in DC. So we have our eSafety Commission in Australia, which has they're our online safety regulator. They were the world's first online safety regulator. And they have got some really interesting powers when it comes to transparency, but I won't get into all the legislation and the powers that they do have. But if anyone is interested in learning about those things, feel free to reach out to me separately. I want to talk more about the policy making side of things for us. And so while the tech industry has really grown and evolved over the years, our approach to policymaking has also had to really evolve so that we can try to keep pace. So for the Australian government, we are becoming much more agile in horizon scanning and considering new and emerging technologies that have or will have consequential impacts on our society. So to design and implement effective, reasonable, proportionate policy and regulatory measures, we now have to consider and balance so many more factors than what we used to. First and foremost, transparency, both in terms of government and industry, human rights, both offline and online, cyber and national security implications, data minimization and privacy protections, and importantly, ensuring that we don't actually stifle industry or innovation in our policies. Most Australian policymakers have not worked for US-based tech companies, which brings an entirely different lens, and don't necessarily have the technical expertise of those who are actually working on these technologies right now. So that is where we really benefit from the Integrity Institute. I've been really heartened with just how willing they are to engage and lend the expertise of members. It means that we have impartial experts that we can look to for perspectives and draw on their technical expertise, which we may not be able to get elsewhere. And it also means that they can get insight into the tech policy and regulatory thinking that is ongoing within the Australian government and contribute ideas to our broader thinking. I have come to the Institute with some really big questions, a lot of them centered around how to balance human rights in the digital environment and in a way that has transparency at its core. So for example, a recent discussion was about the increasing use of anonymizing technologies that dramatically improve privacy tools and data security, but at the same time make it really difficult for democratic governments to protect their citizens from harm, like from becoming victims of crime, for example. So in Australia, we now have the challenge of figuring out how to reconcile these two objectives, protecting the right to privacy while also protecting the right to freedom from harm. Um, we really believe that these two objectives don't have to be in competition with one another. So we're constantly considering different approaches and emerging technologies that could help us in doing both without compromising on either. And also while ensuring that product functionality and user experiences aren't negatively impacted. And so we were able to sit down with experts from the Institute and had a really insightful discussion about what technical solutions are even within the realm of possibility here, like perhaps not possible now, but what about in the future? And so this kind of access and insight that we get from working with the Institute and consulting with the Institute, access directly into the US-based trust and safety world is really valuable to us in our policymaking around tech. And I really look forward to continuing on the journey with them.
Thank you so much, Alana. I think, Colin, you're back.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. That was actually beautiful because Alana teed things up really nicely. I echo a lot of her comments about the value of the Integrity Institute and the input they provide. So we're coming from a different perspective. We are regulators, not policymakers. So we are another online safety regulator, soon to be online safety regulator, as opposed to the legislators who set out the policy priorities in law. We as regulators create the conditions for compliance, and then also are responsible for supervising and enforcing compliance with the regulatory frameworks. So we do this through different regulatory outputs like guidance, codes of practice, etc. And I think it's important to underscore that as a public body, we have a lot of considerations that we have to take into account because the actions that we take can have such significant impacts on the companies and markets that we regulate, but also the services that UK citizens and others use and how they use them. So the types of things that we have to take on board are proportionality in terms of costs, administrative burden, impacts on fundamental rights and freedoms, and above all, whether the interventions will be effective, whether the types of tools or the types of levers that we're reaching for are actually going to have a meaningful impact, or going to be practical and implementable ways of achieving the policy outcomes that we're seeking to realize. So this is where the Integrity Institute comes in. In order to know whether or not an intervention is going to be effective, we first need to know how it's going to be implemented. And in order to know that, we need to know more about how these types of companies and platforms work, whether it's with regards to the technology, their internal policies, governance, culture, platform dynamics, etc. And the Integrity Institute is a really unique fountain of knowledge on all of those aspects, ranging from specific insights on how things like recommender systems work, the types of data and inputs that go into that, the way that they're calibrated internally, as well as the different internal dynamics, the different teams which might be involved and how. And that's really unique and valuable information for us as regulators, because not only do we want to make sure that that any kind of interventions that we're making are effective and proportionate and necessary in achieving our legitimate aim, we also want to try to make sure that, to the best of our ability, we're anticipating any type of unintended consequences from these types of interventions. So being able to soundboard specific proposals and say, okay, how would this play out in the wild? What should we be alive to? What are the potential risks? Are there any things that we're not thinking through here? How difficult would it be to get this metric? Is this as much of a burden as we think it might be? Those are all the types of questions that we've come to Integrity Institute with and gotten really great engagement and and insights back from. But we've also engaged more broadly, which I think is worth mentioning. Jeff, Sahar, and others have come to Ofcom to give Big Tent cross Ofcom teach-ins on things like transparency reporting metrics. And that's been a really great way to not just build our specific understanding, but raise understanding across the shop of dozens of regulators, most of whom may not have worked on digital or internet regulation. People might be coming from broadcast or coming from network and communications and have a really different skill set and understanding of the digital ecosystem. So being able to have that firsthand knowledge and raise our baseline understanding on things like data and data sets to track harms, or things like service design, or the way that internal processes work on social media platforms, it's really helpful. It makes us better at our jobs, and it makes us ask better questions from there on. So it's provided a really useful baseline to enable that kind of collaboration, as well as I think improving the quality and the practicality of our regulatory outputs. So just before I pass back, I think it's worth also mentioning that even though we're in the process of designing this initial tranche of regulatory outputs, I think that the work and insights of this group will only become more valuable, because like many other regimes in this space, the UK Online Safety Bill isn't intended to be a one and done. This is meant to be a bit more of an iterative regime, that it's necessary for it to be able to evolve in keeping with the evolving landscape of the technologies that we're regulating and the harms that are experienced. So yeah, we need to be continuously monitoring what is implemented and how. And also, I'll just say that we do have powers for things like skilled persons reports, or there are other auditing provisions and other regimes which will be really it will be crucial to have this kind of insider information to be able to get that set up and make sure that we're pointing things in the right direction. I'll hang it up there for now, because I think I've gone over, but I could say more if it's helpful.
Colin, it was like you were reading my mind. I think we were reading from exactly the same playbook. That is exactly our experience as well. So I second everything that you just said.
Thank you so much for everybody who just spoke there. Eli, might you offer us one reflection, and in the interest of time, I think we're gonna go directly.
Yeah, so I think a lot of my reflections will flow from the next panel in particular, but sort of my key takeaway here, sitting in Silicon Valley, is that the US government and regulation is not leading in this space. And that's sort of obvious given the nationality of speakers. But I think what you heard very clearly is the innovation that's happening in Europe and the UK and Australia and elsewhere is really what's driving the companies. And there's demand from the regulators for expert input from the Integrity Institute. So I think that kind of demand signal is really rare, and something that my fellow funders on the call should really pay attention to, and just think about all the opportunity there. So I'll leave it at that, but fantastic conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Eli. And for the next panel, we've heard a lot about what makes transparency meaningful, and we actually have one particular geography in the world now where there are a lot of experiments and trials and errors of figuring out how to actually implement that. So for the next panel, we've had a last minute change. We're gonna have Professor Rebecca Trumbull go first as an expert in this space to talk about some of the opportunities ahead of us, especially in the EU with the Digital Services Act. Next, we're going to have a collection of folks from the Integrity Institute who's participated in the EU Code of Practice on Disinformation process last year, followed by Luca Nicotra from Avaz as to bring some of his perspective as an advocate in the space. Following the panel, we're going to have Gus Rossi from the Media Network to offer some reflection. So Professor Trumbull, the mic is yours.
Thanks, Sean, and apologies. Thanks for letting me jump the queue. As you may hear in my voice, I am quite sick, and all of my travels, especially in Europe, dealing with these very issues that we're here talking about today are what have me utterly exhausted and feeling a little bit like I might collapse at any minute. So I'm going to keep it particularly brief today for your benefit, but also for mine. For those that I haven't met before, I am the director of the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics at George Washington University. And I have been working on platform transparency and accountability issues, particularly data access for research purposes for a number of years, essentially for 5 years now. And we have made an incredible amount of progress, particularly in Europe and other non-US jurisdictions, as Eli was just really highlighting. But we were always seeing, right, those of us who were doing this work, working closely with policymakers and regulators in jurisdictions that were interested in taking some of this up, we always had this really clear challenge that there was lack of communication with, lack of insight from those who had really had their hands in the muck, right, had been inside the platforms and could speak to what goes on day in and day out, what's reasonable, what isn't. And so as we were asking for things like, appropriate data access for researchers, we were often getting pushback that would say, oh, well, this just isn't feasible. This isn't possible. You're not asking the right questions. And we didn't have folks to turn to sort of check those claims that were coming from the platforms. And I've been absolutely thrilled since Integrity Institute came on the scene. That's precisely the sorts of questions that we're able to take to the members of Integrity, and that we've been able to form really strong partnerships as we work with regulators. But the other hat, right, that I wear in this conversation is as an academic researcher myself, leading a research institute and also working collaboratively with researchers all over the world who are trying to investigate and share with the public, policymakers and regulators exactly what sort of impacts for both good and ill the platforms are having. And I think it's really, really important that we do a lot more going forward, and Integrity I see is absolutely instrumental to this, to build bridges between those academic researchers and, again, the very integrity workers themselves who understand from an inside perspective, what are the most important questions? What are the types of data that we should be asking for? What are the reasonable requests and what are unreasonable requests? And through the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics, we formed a strong partnership with the Integrity Institute, have begun that work already and will continue it in the weeks and months to come in a way that I'm really, really excited about. All right, I will leave it at that. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you so much, Professor Trumbull. And next, Shug, Dylan, Jeff, I think the floor is yours.
Hey folks, so I'm Dylan Moses. It's good to meet all of you. So I've worked at a few platform companies before coming to law school, and between the work that I did on supporting the efforts after Christchurch or banning Alex Jones, I feel like I've never had as much impact on the world in terms of regulating social media platforms and the real world effects of that work before I got to the Integrity Institute. And so I just want to give a shout out to everyone in the room who does a lot of that work, folks like Sean, folks like Abby, everyone else. Thank you so much for the work that you've done so far. One area I think in particular that I think I was particularly impactful on, and Jeff and Shug can also speak to this, was a lot of the work that we did on the code of disinformation, code of practice for disinformation. And for folks who aren't familiar with it, it's an opportunity. This is in the EU. It's an opportunity for self-governance for the cross-platform issue of disinformation, and working on ways to have platforms come together to think about ways to demonetize disinformation for advertising, things like transparency around political advertisements, and empowering researchers and users to act on disinformation. So whether or not that's just being aware of the signs of disinformation on a platform, or giving researchers the access to start asking the questions about how the platforms operate when they propagate disinformation on the platforms as well. So that work was really important. I think some other stuff that we've done, and Sahar, Jeff, and others have alluded to it as well, but we do a lot of policy consultations with a number of regulators, obviously, both within the United States and outside the United States. I had the opportunity over the last year to work with folks on the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, the Digital Services Oversight and Safety Act, We've done policy consultations with folks from Google, from Pinterest, and the like. And so a lot of that work has just been really, really impactful. And you've seen a lot of the testimonials that have been given back so far. And a big reason why I decided to go to law school in the first place was to work on these types of issues. And so having the Integrity Institute and having folks like Jeff and Sahar there to provide that foundation to start working on a lot of these issues at a larger scale has been great so far. So I'll pass it off to Jeff or someone else.
I say go for it, Chug.
Yeah, so hey everyone, I'm Shug. I'm a fellow at the Integrity Institute. Yeah, just talking a little bit more about the code of practice work that we got to do. I also found this really valuable and rewarding. And one of the things that was very clear in our conversations with the code of practice, which Luca will probably touch on in a minute here, is when we joined as like a fairly like new folks like in the space. Like a lot of these folks had been working on this problem for a really long time. And I remember we were on like a pretty long call with a bunch of folks trying to figure this out, including with some of the companies and stuff. And we were able to really have a large impact on the conversation because you could just really feel in the room that the need for people who had done the work in the platforms, but were not associated with the platforms, because platforms have a lot of times there'll be like a certain ask from a regulator, let's say on transparency, of like, can you do X? Can you do Y? And then the regulator will say, or the company will say like, no, that's totally unreasonable. And it's very difficult unless you've actually done the work in the companies to say whether or not that's true or not. And we have that ability because we know what it takes. We've been in the muck, as Rebecca said, that we understand like what it takes to put out something that is reasonable. And we can also help, and we have helped guide a lot of these efforts in the highest impact way that also like is feasible for companies to do. So companies don't have the necessary excuse saying that we can't do it. We know that they can, and we can push back on that because of the expertise that we bring to the table. And so that's been a real rewarding thing for me personally, working with the Integrity Institute and having these conversations with policymakers to be able to bring that to the table. And I think it definitely feels like it's really been felt on the other side there as well.
And I'll try to be a little bit quick. So, you know, we're talking about bridge building, and one of the metaphors that we've always stuck with, you know, at the Integrity Institute is, you know, we're trying to build a bridge between the technology world, the tech world, and the policy world, and we're sort of coming at it from the tech side, right, the side of tech. And, you know, in a lot of ways, I always kind of say this over and over again, that we're the luckiest nonprofit in the history of nonprofits, right? It is a little bit of a gamble, right? That when we're building the bridge from the tech side, that we will find people on the policy side to meet up with. It's also a little bit of a gamble that like people on the tech side will be interested in building that bridge. And sort of like all of these questions that we had of like, will this work out? It's always been the case that like, yes, it will work out. Like, yes, there are tons of people on the other side who will reach out. And I have been waiting for you, you know, in a lot of ways. I remember, you know, back in 2017, I think it was, when I was working at Facebook, you know, this was when, you know, Mark Zuckerberg went at the hearing, and one of the senators asked him, like, what is Facebook's business policy or business, you know, model? And Mark Zuckerberg is like, Senator, we sell ads. And I remember all the memes, you know, shared on Workplace, you know, at Facebook of all the company or the employees being like, oh my God, like there's our fearless leader, you know, saying we sell ads, and turned it into a meme. But, you know, when you're working on these problems, right, when you're actually trying to clean up the stuff on the platform, at that time, it was a little bit like, oh, I guess policy isn't going to be coming to our rescue, right? Like if we're going to be fixing the platform, it's going to come from us on the inside. And, you know, a little bit of like, what a difference 5 years makes. You know, right from the get-go, when we started reaching out to people at the Integrity Institute, we found tons of allies on the policy side who were very, very ready to hold our hand and walk us through the policy world and walk us through the government space and the advocacy space, and find opportunities for us to have impact. So I'm super glad we're able to have Colin here, who was like one of our earliest friends. You know, we have Luca and Avaz. Avaz was also one of like our earliest allies, and Gus from Omidyar, which has been a huge help. And so there's just been like every single time we sort of, you know, stuck our head out and said, hey, is anyone interested in what tech workers might have to say on this policy decision? We found allies who've been like, heck yes. And we're also super duper lucky to have, you know, in our membership, right? Like Dylan, who is going to school to turn himself into a bridge between the tech and the policy world. You know, we have Shug, who has always, you know, been eager to raise the hand and saying like, does anyone want to help out on this policy question? He's always been there. You know, we have Katie, who will speak next, who's like, you know, a one-person bridge between the tech and policy world. And so just a lot of ways in which we're like super duper lucky, and that we've had allies who've enabled us to really capitalize on the moment and find real impact out there.
I think that's a great segue to Luca.
Good morning, afternoon, everybody. I'm so happy to be at this beautiful day of celebration of the work of the Integrity Institute, and in this year and a half that feels like a decade, I would say. I'm Luca Nicotra. I'm a research and campaign director at Avaz, which is a global NGO that I would say for the last 5 years, the timeline coincides with some of you, have been trying to be on the forefront of, well, overall, the fight against disinformation and tech harms, but in particular on my side, in supporting EU regulators in what is possibly the most ambitious multinational framework to curb tech harms while still protecting freedom of speech, of which the Digital Services Act and the Code of Practice are some of the highlights already quoted. And of course, when such an unprecedented regulatory attempt is put in place, there is a huge technical gap that is immediately obvious. And in particular, for Europe, for the European Commission, it had never basically actually enforced tech regulation directly, and always, you know, mostly delegated to national regulators. And so tech companies had, and lobby groups in general had, you know, been taking advantage of this gap, and to mostly draw a false red line, as it has been mentioned, to, you know, of what is possible, what is not possible, what is available, what is not available. And I think on our side, we tried to do our best and try to, you know, counterbalance representing citizens, consumers, but it's clearly, I think, wasn't enough. I think when 3 years into this effort, we heard of this, you know, and maybe feeling a little bit lonely, we heard of this, you know, bunch of integrity experts willing to start up this crazy idea of an integrity institute. I think we immediately understood it would be one of a key superpower exactly for this moment. And we decided to help, and we decided to make use of it. And Jeff and others have, you know, spoke about the collaboration with the Code of Practice, where I feel we initially were pretty much isolated. Basically, the first NGO to join, it had a horrible brand because of the failure of the previous attempt. We first convinced fact checkers to come on board, other NGOs, but I would really say that when the Integrity Institute actually joined that process, it was one of the tipping points. And I can't tell you how, you know, the number of meetings where regulators since then are quoting the Integrity Institute and verbatim some of their proposed transparency measures, mandated data sets, mitigation measures, you know, to back what also Shag said, you know, we've been in a few meetings where Integrity Institute fundamentally moved the platform's representative from saying this is impossible to my management doesn't want to do it, which you can, as you can imagine, is a key change of perspective for a regulator, you know, looking to create a balanced proposal. And finally, what I want to mention is that another issue with policymakers is that they don't really read academic research. Over the years, we've tried to, develop more targeted disinformation analysis, also targeting mainstream media that could help them understand the phenomenon live or while it was happening. But even there, I feel like some of the work done by the Integrity Institute has been really incredibly useful, from the analysis done on the Facebook Wild Review content report that really showcase what could be done even with that super small and ridiculously small data set, and or the misinformation amplification analysis that we've been repurposing on our side for Europe. And yeah, looking ahead, my hope is, of course, that you keep doing all you're doing. I would say that beyond the code, the DSA will soon face an implementation challenge. We've seen groundbreaking regulation failing in implementation phase, and I really hope we can embed some of the Integrity Institute expertise within that process, because it's going to be key for us and for hopefully for the social internet. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Luca. Gus, might you offer us some reflection, and then we can take a few questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to make two interrelated points. One, I think that it's very clear of the importance of having an organization that can make arguments on policy issues from a position of authority. That completely changes how policymakers and staffers of policymakers perceive and think what is possible and what is happening. In absence of institutions and practitioners like the ones that participate in the Integrity Institute, it's only the platforms that can make those arguments. Therefore, the results are going to be one. And that's, as Luca was saying, that's important for enforcement, that's important for policy development, that's important to call on the bullshit of platforms when they're lying. And that's critical. And that, as I see friends from many foundations, I also think it's important to reflect on the cross-cutting value of this work. If we don't have meaningful transparency, if we don't have elements, we have folks working for the public interest, willing to challenge the design of policy and the design of corporate policy, it's impossible that we can achieve kid safety. It's impossible we can achieve a meaningful understanding of how to have competition in the technology space. It's hard at many levels. It's not only that this information on its own is a cross-cutting issue, is that the expertise that Integrity Institute puts at the service of the public interest has cross-cutting impact that affects the mission of, I would say, 90 or 100% of the foundations that are here present. So I think those were the things that came to mind as I was listening to this presentation.
Thank you so much, Gus. I know we're over time, but we've just wrapped up two panels, very focused on different aspects of transparency. So if there are any burning questions, I think now is a good time to make sure we get to them, if anyone has them, or if Rachel, you want to call on a few folks who might have shared in chat.
We had a lot of comments in chat, not a ton of questions, except for Matt Abrams at the very beginning, who's really interested in the Integrity Institute's function as sort of an independent oversight board as a service. We've sometimes described ourselves as an open source integrity team, the world's open source integrity team. And we will be talking about that in literally the next few minutes, to talk about levers that are available outside of directly influencing public policy itself. But I really do, folks here in the audience who are listening, if you want to Raise your hand in the chat or raise your hand in reactions, or even just unmute and ask a question. Now is a great time. We'll take 30 seconds to process everything that everybody's just had the chance to hear. And we might just be ready to move forward. Fabulous. People are listening. I think we can take it away.
All right, sounds good. I'll follow directions here. So as Rachel just said, we've heard a lot about different policies, but as we've shared, there are also ways to directly influence company behavior outside of what we might consider formal public policy. So for the next panel, I'm going to bring up some of my colleagues at Integrity Institute who can share some of these other levers that people who are interested in affecting change might be able to pull. And so Abby, Katie, Jeff, the floor is yours. And then afterwards, we'll have Michelle reflect a little bit and followed by Q&A at the end.
Thank you, Sean, and thanks everyone. I'm Abby. I'm the research project manager for the Institute, supporting our work on the think tank side of things. And like Sean said, I'm going to offer a little bit of framing about our work in the think tank outside of the policy work. Over the last 2 years, we've been building out our body of work to strengthen the integrity profession and elevate our members and bring knowledge to external stakeholders, as Sahar and Jeff mentioned in the intro. And to do this, in addition to directly engaging on public policy, as you've heard, we sort of work along 3 other tracks of work, I'll say. The first is this being the world's open source integrity team. We conduct open source research to impact companies and improve public understanding of the mechanics of platforms by replicating some of the research and knowledge that's known on the inside. An example of this is our regular analysis of Facebook's widely viewed content report, which brings insights from the quarterly report that Facebook releases, and in some instances has brought new information to Facebook itself about what's happening on their platform, how they're reporting on it, and they have made public corrections thanks to Jeff analysis. The second track, Sean, you can go ahead, is our best practices work. And here we convene members to foster consensus on industry best practices for specific areas that then can serve as resources for integrity professionals, people within the industry, as well as sort of publicly available resources for people trying to understand more about these topics, including policymakers. And examples here you see on the screen, the transparency decks that serve as the baseline for what we recommend to companies who have asked for input on their transparency reports and efforts. We have a best practices for startups on how to integrate integrity as a company is being built up. And we also have a series of on best practices on elections integrity as part of a larger elections integrity program, which Katie will talk more about in a minute. And you can see some of the aspects of that here. But finally, the third track and sort of the framing of this is to engage directly with the companies themselves and to channel member expertise to give input directly on specific integrity issues or practices that the company has. And sometimes this comes at the company's request. We gave feedback on TikTok's transparency reports at their invitation and participated in a private roundtable to discuss those recommendations. We also brought members to participate in a workshop on Google's quality ranking system at their invitation. And then other times there are public input processes that we can feed into along the lines of the Meta Oversight Board's open calls for public comment on specific cases. And you see on the slide the specific case on the approach to a specific term. So those are the kind of non-policy tracks that we work on the think tank side and the research that we produce, but I will stop here and hand it over to Katie to dig a little deeper on the elections work.
Yeah, thanks, Abby. And it's so great to see so many friends and everyone. I'm Katie Harbath. I'm a senior advisor at the Integrity Institute and spent 10 years at Facebook working on a lot of these issues. And it's been so wonderful to be able to continue this work outside of the company and to continue to work with so many folks that I had worked with there, and then meet so many folks at other platforms and things that we're working on. And as many of you who know me, elections is one of my greatest passions and areas of work in this space. And 2024 coming up is going to be an unprecedented year of elections. There's not only going to be a US presidential election, but for the first time ever in the same year, we will also have elections in India, Indonesia, Ukraine, Taiwan, Mexico, the United Kingdom, European Parliament, and many, many more. There's going to be about 65 elections across, I think, 54 countries next year. This is a lot. This is not only a big geopolitical moment for the world, but it's going to be a lot of fronts for companies to have to fight in thinking about protecting their platforms when it comes to elections. And thanks to such a generous grant from the Knight Foundation and others, we have started our Elections Integrity Project at the Institute, where we've done things thus far. Last year in the lead up to the US midterms and Brazil, we did a series of informational sessions for members to come and ask questions and learn a bit more about election integrity work. Earlier this year, we released an election cycle tracker so that people could get a long-term look at what upcoming elections might be happening. And we also built a dashboard to kind of break that down even further to how many elections per year, by region, by country, all those different things to really help companies aid in planning. What I'm most excited about, though, is that very soon we're going to be releasing part 1 of an election integrity best practices deck that is going to be able to not just help companies, but also help to inform policymakers, civil society, the media, and others about how this work should potentially be put together inside of companies and to help to think about these challenges. Because we have a lot of platforms who are thinking about this for the first time, new tools such as AI that we're going to need to think about that is going to massively change how these elections work in 2024. And so having funding and help to be able to do this is absolutely critical right now, because we need to be building up those foundations now to be ready for when those elections happen in 2024. And we have a lot of other things planned to be able to help to provide more support and insight to all the different companies and folks working in this space on elections. And with that, I'll turn it back to Abby.
Thanks, Katie. I think I will call on Jeff here to share any more examples that you have in mind of this other sort of non-policy work.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick since, you know, everyone's heard my voice a bunch. I think one thing to highlight from what Katie mentioned before was our elections huddles. And this was leading up to the midterms last year. Every week on Friday, we had what we called an election huddle. And it was just an opportunity for anyone in our membership who was actively working on an election for a platform or had in the past worked on an election for a platform. And it was a space for, you know, the people working on it right now to be like, hey, has anyone worked on this problem before? How did you tackle this? Or like, we're really nervous that, you know, we're not covered on this front. You know, how do I convince myself that we are doing enough? And it was a space for the people who, you know, are working on it for the first time to talk to people who've been there before and done it before. And, you know, this actually did have a lot of impact at some of the startups or some of the mid-sized companies, you know, that were thinking about elections at scale for the first time. You know, obviously since November, right, like the industry, there's been an industry downturn that's been going through, you know, causing a little bit of turmoil like in our members' lives, you know, as they get laid off or they leave companies amidst all sorts of chaotic situations. And so actually just like a lot of behind the scenes sort of acting as a jobs board, acting as a professional network has actually been a really, you know, lever of power for us and helping, you know, really smart people with tons of experience get placed, you know, when companies are hiring to fill their roles right now. And so I think there's definitely like a lot of behind the scenes work, right, that like will never be made public, right? Like we're never gonna broadcast that we're having, you know, elections huddles or broadcast what is asked in them. But it is, you know, a really key way for us to have impact in the space.
Thank you, Jeff. Michelle, might you offer some reflection, and then we can use the remaining 9 minutes or so for Q&A?
Happy to. I feel like I have a privileged position to offer reflections at the end of all three panels, so I'll try to be broad but also brief. I'm really struck by the massive translation moment that we're in. I mean, this is I came into Ford as a tech fellow and learned quickly that the job of a tech fellow at Ford and often in other locations is really to translate more so than to be like, I at least didn't come with any coding or programming experience. So that was at least where I was able to plug in. But it feels like learning to speak each other's language right now is as important as getting any of these elements right on the first try, right? In fact, we can be sure that just like tech design choices, lots of policy design choices will have unintended consequences, might not sort of get the right intervention on the first try, but actually being able to communicate effectively, being able to be proactive in citing those consequences or likely consequences, being able to iterate and redirect rapidly once we see consequences occurring. All of that capacity actually depends on translation and being able to be in the same room as representative communities, including the expertise of people who have direct experience working on platforms, and actually be able to have the same conversation and know what each other mean by the words that we're using. So often we use different words and don't know what each other's jargon means. And I think just as often we use the same words and often around values, transparency, accountability, but it actually bears like really getting into the weeds of what that means in practice. Platforms have cultures, platforms have languages. There's a sort of rarefied experience and language that comes from direct experience working on those platforms. I think that language is currently inaccessible to policymakers, to advocates, to many researchers, but it doesn't have to be. And I think that's what we've heard very strongly today. I'm struck by the incredibly broad remit of integrity professionals, like a job category that I think didn't even formally exist 10 years ago, right? And who are now in a position to provide such critical perspective on things like elections integrity, national security, free speech, and more. So I really want to thank Integrity Institute for building this bridge, for seeing themselves as part of an effective ecosystem, for prioritizing public interest values, and for modeling like openness and transparency and humility in their own work. I'd be really eager to follow up with anyone on the funding side to share notes, or anyone else who's interested to chat. And just thank you for everyone for attending today.
Great, thank you so much, Michelle. Yeah, so we have about 6 minutes, less than what we had originally planned for, but I'm gonna call on my colleague Rachel to see if there are any burning questions that people have submitted through the chat.
There are not, and I think I would offer as a prompt, it's just been so much content to take in. I also wonder if any of our panelists have questions for funders in terms of what funders' approaches or thought processes are for funding in this space, observations on your interactions with Funderland so far in the US, in the EU, or more globally. Not to solicit questions from you all, as well as from the funders and guests who are here in the audience. And I'll say that we're also going to follow up to everyone who's on this call and who registered for this call but couldn't come, with the recording, with the transcript, and it's a great chance to follow up with additional questions as everything percolates and as you go back into your work and make connections that way too.
I see a couple of raised hands. Colin, you're the first on my screen, so I'm going to call you first.
I love the opportunity to ask funders a question. I just wondered if any of the funders would be able to speak to the extent to which their objectives align with those core missions of the Integrity Institute, or of the align with the objectives of different emerging online safety type regulations around the world. It would be useful to understand where there are points of synergy that could be further explored, or where there might be differences of strategy or perspective from a regulator vantage point.
In the interest of time, I'll jump in really quickly, although I'd be curious to hear from others as well. I will say from Ford Foundation's perspective, because we're a 501c3 funder, we don't take a particular perspective in any policy, as particularly legislative fights. But what we're interested in is building infrastructure for effective conversations about regulatory and legislative proposals. So really interested in where there are opportunities to build cross-sector infrastructure for civil society, people with industry experience, and researchers and regulators to have those kinds of conversations. So exactly what we're talking about today is really the strategy that we pursue, at least through my portfolio at Ford Foundation, which is something called the Public Interest Technology Catalyst Fund, if that matters. So I'd love to, I see Eli has a hand up, would love to hear from other funders as well.
Yeah, so I think like just I think the signal from regulators, and so like, you know, not to go down the weeds, but under US tax law, like lobbying means a certain thing, and providing technical assistance to regulators oftentimes is a much safer, less politically risky thing. I think speaking on behalf of the Hewlett Foundation and Futures, yes, like would love to talk more about ways to collaborate, ways to co-fund, ways to really channel resources into this field. Is if you think about just one example, like data access under the DSA, transparency, and all those linked things, how do you build and sustain the infrastructure that researchers are going to need, assuming there are terabytes of data that prove forthcoming to them? That is a hugely expensive, taxing thing that philanthropies alone are not going to fund. And so there are lots of opportunities like that where the result of regulation requires collaboration with philanthropy, and tons of opportunities here to help shape this nascent field and achieve positive impact. So just to say, very eager to collaborate and to talk and to bring other funders along. And I think that could even be a follow-on conversation to try to bring funders and regulators together to have a more focused conversation about shared priorities. And I, for one, would love to help organize and participate in that.
Thank you both. Brenda, you've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, I actually will take a quick pause. I have kind of a wrap-up thought, but I think for questions for the funders, I'll leave space for that for some more.
Great. I don't see any other funders immediately having their hands raised, so I think Brandon, with the last minute or so, please go for it.
Yeah, I'll go super quick, but I just want to echo some. I think one of the themes I heard in this, and one that I think really resonates with me, is, I think we're at an inflection point globally for the internet. I think since it was built, it has largely existed as a kind of wild west with private companies doing and building whatever they wanted. But we're now entering a new era where the public and regulators and lawmakers are beginning to set some rules for the road, but there's not the expertise out there to do it effectively. And I think the Integrity Institute has the potential to be one of the most important organizations in the world when it comes to helping protect the internet. In a lot of ways, it already is. And for me, the big question is it going to take 4 to 5 years to get to the level of maturity that I think it and actually the entire rest of this field needs, or can we accelerate that and trying to avoid years of shitty regulation being passed that sets us back? And so, yeah, I think it's a very unique moment we're in, and the question is how effectively can we take advantage of it? So, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Brendan. Yeah, we're at the last minute, and Eli and Michelle have both shared their perspectives. Really appreciate you both for sponsoring today's briefing. I think to close, I'll pass it over to Sahar for some final thoughts and also appreciation to all of you.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, everyone. I hope this was fun for you. We've never done something like this before, and I appreciate your faith in us, or at least curiosity to come, and especially stay the whole time. If you like it, or even like parts of it, please let us know so we can do it again and maybe cover things that you might want. It really is delightful to see all these people in the same room. And there's, beyond a sense of sort of power and possibility, there's also just a sense of like community. And it's good to remember that you all and the organizations you represent, but also just as people, are here because you care, and are here because maybe you like thinking about the big things. And that's really nice. It's a personal pleasure of mine to just be able to introduce our members on the call, some of whom you've heard from and some of whom you haven't, to this world as well. And that's great. We titled this, Is This the Policy Moment? And I think that we've talked a little bit about different facets of what that looks like, including from the C3, we don't like the word policy facet, which is important. And the, can we interact with companies directly lens and stuff like that. What I'd love to leave you with is beyond appreciation is a variation on what Brandon so brilliantly said. In 5 years, maybe this won't be hot anymore, right? After 2024 and the huge wave of elections, maybe companies will cut their integrity teams to the bone, and maybe people who want to do the work will lose it, like want to fund the work, will lose interest. I think now we have the opportunity to sort of head off that problem. We have the opportunity to do things like argue that these kinds of workers should have power, but also be hired at these companies and define what that role looks like and set the expectation. We also have the opportunity to bake in good stuff in the world and in companies before, new challenges arise and people lose interest or things just feel stale. And that's important. I don't think that we have all the answers as people. I'm personally interested a lot in how do we build up the profession inside of companies and how do we make it seem less of a cost center and more of a, integrated part of the company that is able to be listened to. But we're trying, and it's not just the brilliance of me and Jeff, or me, Jeff, Rachel, Abby, Sean, Susanna, etc., but also just all of our members working together and all of us, in partnership working together. We are 3 minutes over, so in conclusion, I'll just say thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your patience. I'm excited to talk to all of you. I personally am happy to stay here an extra 10 minutes if anyone wants to talk more in small groups or one-on-one. And thanks for all that you do.
Thanks
I
so
now
much.
release you. Gong.
Great seeing
Thanks,
you all.
everyone.
Thank you so much.
Really good to see you all
Thanks,
today. Thank
guys.
you.
See you later.